Well, Toby Keith's cross-border success is certainly not isolated. I recently sat down with OSU Economic Researcher Kyle Dean to talk about the growing dependence our two states have on each other. Kyle, in terms of our economy, does Oklahoma actually need Texas?
Well, in terms of our economy, we would say that Oklahoma and Texas outcomes are somewhat linked. In particular, Oklahoma needing Texas. As Texas grows, we find that Oklahoma actually grows as a result of that Texas growth. So absolutely.
Now, I've heard you use the term megalopolis. I want you to tell us exactly what that is.
Well, other than being a tongue twister, a megalopolis is a grouping of metropolises. This idea of a megalopolis started in the 60s with a French geographer known as Jean Gottman. And what he studied was this idea that in the Northeast, there were certain metropolises that their fates were linked. They shared production, or perhaps they shared culture, or they shared other resources. And this megalopolis in the Northeast became known as the Boss Wash, so it extended all the way from Boston down to Washington, D.C. It included all of the major metropolitans in between. Over time, people started looking at other large agglomerations of metropolises. And so currently there's not an official recognition of a megalopolis, but there's an unofficial recognition, if you will, that there are 10 megalopolises. And the I35 corridor, of which we're a part, is one of those 10 megalopolises.
And I want you to tell us exactly what the I35 corridor is and why it has become so important.
Okay. The I35 corridor, it's kind of interesting. It's a different thing for different people in different regions. So if you were to do a search on the I35 corridor, you might find a report from, let's say, the Department of Transportation in Iowa talking about the I35 corridor. Well, most people don't recognize Iowa or Des Moines as a part of the I35 corridor. The way that we've defined the I35 corridor is it's the area around I35 that extends from Kansas City southward all the way to San Antonio, Texas.
So as Texas grows, how does that impact Oklahoma?
Well, in a number of ways. Certainly, as Texas grows, they buy inputs into manufacturing. They buy retail goods from Oklahoma producers. And recently, I guess in the last few years, there was a group that purchased the Texoma Lodge and that property surrounding there. So one of the things they're looking to do is to create a tourism destination. They're looking to have a few golf courses, essentially make it a nice place for Texas residents to go, as well as Oklahoma residents. And one thing that we're seeing as Texas grows is the population is pushing farther and farther north toward Oklahoma. And the more that occurs, the more it becomes feasible for Texas residents to come and tour Oklahoma lakes, spend in Oklahoma malls, buy inputs from Oklahoma producers.
So in your research, what will the future hold?
Well, certainly Texas growth is going to continue farther north. And the more farther north that occurs, we believe that these two regions are going to be more inextricably linked than they are even today. And one of the things about megalopolises that we need to think about is, as we're working in a global economy, a megalopolis, when you pair these metropolises together and they specialize in certain production items or manufacturing or whatever, the more competitive certain megalopolises can be on the world market, the better off they're going to be. And so when it comes to Oklahoma City and Dallas-Fort Worth, there might be areas that those two regions can cooperate together to create infrastructure, certain projects that will make both of them more competitive on a global market. And so in the future, I would expect policies to be formed where we can create a nice competitive environment that includes both Oklahoma City and Dallas, and maybe even extends down to Austin and up to Tulsa and down on to San Antonio, and then maybe even up to Kansas City.
So while we may be rivals on the football field, we may well be partners in the boardroom.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much, Kyle Dean.
You bet.